Last time on Two Women Talking, we were just getting into the idea of earnestness overcoming, kind of turning things into a polemic. But then we had to stop the recording and start a new one. And while I was setting it up again, I thought of another element of that I think, going back to Saul Kripke and the boys, we talk about like character and theme and you know, tell a good story. And then we talk about politics. But there's this in between that I think is part of the problem that people miss, that philosophy, the philosophy of a work, kind of, it should be where things land. Philosophy, everybody's got a philosophy, everybody's got a worldview.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that, you know, Greg Maguire and Wicked is a shining example of one who the philosophy, it went too far in the book into just straight up lecturing the reader on stuff. Whereas somebody like a J.R.R. Tolkien, an Alan Moore in comics, Grant Morrison, when Grant Morrison is on, as opposed to on a lot of drugs, as opposed to Grant Morrison's whole phase of working a lot of shit out. You know, they managed a philosophy, they managed a why in a story without dumping onto just a political screed.
And like, I think that's part of the problem you get into when you get like in comics. Ever since Watchmen came out, everyone's been trying to recreate Watchmen. Ever since The Dark Knight came out, the comic, not the movie, everyone's wanted to recreate that. And those in particular are deconstructions.
Right.
Which leads to these layers upon layers of deconstruction that we've had in comics over the years, which is just exhausting, and it's terrible for character development. Because deconstructions like that work much better if you know you have an end point and you have something you're getting to. It doesn't really work in long-term serialization like that. But so we get these people who, Grant Morrison, whether you agree with him or not,
is it him? It's them, isn't it? I don't know. I think Grant Morrison's they them. Okay, I'll check, but keep talking.
Okay, so you get someone like Grant Morrison or these other authors or writers who they know what they're doing and they're good at what they're doing. But then you get people who they want to do that same thing without understanding how that works or why that works. And so they end up making a cheap copy. And they know that there's a point being made. So they're trying to make a point, but they don't have the nuance and they don't have the skill to come across the same way. So they just kind of bludgeon you with it. And I think that's a lot of the problem we're seeing now is, as much as bad writing gets used to really just mean it's something I don't like, that doesn't invalidate the fact that there is a lot of bad writing out there. And we do get a lot of people who they just don't know what they're doing and they're trying to imitate something without actually knowing what it is they're working with. It's like when you start drawing and it's, I want to draw anime style, or for me, I want to draw a Disney-esque style. Well, you still need to understand how the human body actually works in order to do that. You know, even someone who draws like Vivzy Pop with a really pronounced style, she still has to understand how the human body works. Otherwise, even your stylized cartoon stuff is going to look weird.
Yeah. And I checked. Okay, Grant Morrison. It's Grant Morrison. So there's no simple answer on pronouns. According to Wikipedia, they never requested they, them pronouns. They have come to prefer them. However, they don't mind being referred to with he, him pronouns. So no wrong answers here. There we go. All right. And there's an example of when somebody might go, why have you got to politicize it? And it's like, that's just what someone prefers to be called.
It's also just basic respect.
Yeah.
And like, here's the thing: when I was younger, I I was, and to an extent still am, really insecure with my, or uncomfortable with my real name.
Mm-hmm.
And so I changed it a lot as a kid. And some of it was dumb geekery stuff. Some of it was, actually just stuff I would go by. Um, but when I was in fourth grade, I think, fourth or fifth grade, you know, my mom told my teacher, hey, she wants to be called this, that, that's what she wants to do.
Right.
And that was respected
Yeah.
for the rest of the year until that summer before the next year started. One of the head teachers, who also happened to be my uncle, who sucks, was
Oh,
like, no,
shit.
she hasn't earned that name.
What?
And
What?
yeah, no. um so just, she had, the name was Thunder, and like, yeah, that's a pretty big name, but like, also, let's take a look at my personality. But he was like, yeah, no, you aren't secure enough in yourself, and that's a name that means I have arrived, and you just, basically, you haven't earned that, as he described it to me when he explained it. um and so years later, I was thinking about the whole pronouns debate,
Mm-hmm.
and I realized it's the same thing as that. And that whole, well, you haven't earned that, well, it's like, who are you to say that?
Right.
Who are you to say what I should be called if that's what I want? So it's like,
Right.
plus, this is going back to my conservative days. I remember the Blair White Candace Owens debate, and just, oh god, that one was such a mess, and it was all Candace Owens' fault.
As it tends to
To
be.
be. But there was one point where she refused to call Blair a she, not even on her own principles, but saying, I would be letting down my audience who expect something from me, so I can't call you a she because of what my audience expects.
And that makes me wonder why Blair White agreed to the interview.
Oh, that was halfway through the debate. And
But
it wasn't
wouldn't
an
I mean,
it
I tend to check people's like
yeah.
social media and things like that. And if I see any misgendering or anything like that, I ask them.
Well, it wasn't even an interview. It was a debate that was being hosted by one of the other right-wing commentators at the time. And it
Right.
was, they were going at each other, but it was mostly Candace who was like, she did that thing where she keeps talking and keeps talking. And as soon as someone tries to get a word in edgewise, it's, well, now you're interrupting me and you won't let me talk. And I'm like, oh,
That's a right wing
oh
go
yeah,
to these
yeah.
days. I hate even to say right wing because they're not right wing.
No, I will say it is. How do I?
Because the Young Turks do the same thing.
Admittedly, I've seen it mostly in women, in particular, a certain type of woman who wants to pull the victim card
Yeah.
when things aren't going their way. But yeah, so the whole point of bringing that up is, after seeing that debate and just the sheer audacity in that, oh well, I won't I won't call you this because my audience would lose respect for me. I'm like, then this debate is going nowhere. And sure enough, the debate went nowhere because
Right.
Candace just kept screaming and Blair
Right.
couldn't get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, and I mean that that brings us to the whole thing about, don't politicize media has two meanings, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's politicization within the work, but then there's also unfair politicization of the work by the people who consume the media.
So that actually brings me to something I would love to talk to you about,
All
which
right.
is the idea that all art is political.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
personally, I hate that.
I do too, because I'm a comedian, and I hate even calling myself a comedian. I'm
Mhm.
just ridiculous. But my background's in comedy,
Mhm.
but it's also in youth programming, and I do fantasy sci-fi stuff.
Mhm.
And I don't consider what I do political,
Mhm.
even though it tends to line up with very sort of progressive stuff, in that, Solomon's a trans man, and there's black characters and all that stuff.
Of course.
But that wasn't political, that was observational and inductive. That and inductive reasoning is taking a specific and then broadening to the general,
Mhm.
right? Let's take this concept and play with it. And I think that the demand that a work be completely knowable, um, going back to Star Wars, for instance,
Mhm.
I would believe that the problem is just it's bad writing if the freakouts happened after we'd seen whether something was particularly well written.
That is a key point.
Right. Like, you can't tell me that the problem with the Acolyte is bad writing. People were flipping their shit the moment it was announced.
Mhm.
The moment people saw Osha's weave, people flipped their shit. We had no idea what the writing was going to be like at that point. That
Yeah.
is, and transference happens. People do put their own stuff onto it. And I try to create stuff that works on more than one level. I mean, Solomon, yeah, he's a trans man, and he's
Mhm.
literally a trans man. He was supposed to be a female character in Lady Bits, but I realized a woman would not say, and I am here to save the world and all the women in it. And so for boss fight, that switched to be
Mhm.
more indicative, and it just sort of worked in that he's the social justice warrior.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean the idea of, like, yes, your own politics are going to affect what you write. But even because, like, I've watched people talk about the is all art political.
right.
And when people say, like in my example, I write fantasy romance, I'm not trying to politicize anything. It's like, oh
Right.
well, be you're that's still an act of politics, and usually it comes down to, oh,
Fence sitting.
you're no, it's I saw I couldn't even understand the argument, but it was like you're making a political decision choosing not to be political, and also it ended up turning into, oh well, it's also classist if you're not
Oh,
being political.
that 70s era backdoor first person storytelling in academia bullshit. I'll just say that right now.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that comes out of that is the metastasizing of decent ideas that come out of works like The Dialectic of Sex, like Sexual Politics. Can people analyze something via political lens? Yes. Does that make the work inherently political? No.
No.
And I do think that that in jumping at shadows and insisting that the intent of something as big as Star Wars or Marvel or something like that, based on a media interview where the question and how the question was raised is as important as the answer that was given.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's because I've seen my answers warped by the
Yeah.
press so often that I'm like, you're told make them like you. when you do these junkets.
Mm-hmm.
You're taught a yes, and like you don't want to get into a fight with the reporter, because especially in the age of social media and YouTube, it's that person's audience that's going to see you.
Yeah.
So in the instance of, say, the recent thing with in my world, nerds are gay on the Acolyte press junket that people are treating as proof of some politics, that's because the actress, her themselves, is non-binary and pansexual. And it's the context of where that quote came from. If you just see that quote, you go, oh God, what is she doing? If you see the 90 seconds of squirming she did, well, the reporter kept saying, so how do you feel about it being the gayest Star Wars ever? Like that, the reporter injected that.
I mean, I still don't think that's the best response. Like,
it's a no win.
Yeah.
You cannot win. It was a gotcha question. I don't think it was intended as a gotcha question, but either she says, no, it's not, and pisses off one group, or she says, yes, it is, and pisses off another group. So she tried to thread the needle and say, to me, nerds have always been gay. That was not a global statement. That was not, she was clearly going, for me, in my experience and what I took from it, which is like, I'm gay, I'm a nerd, I've always been a nerd, nerds have always been gay to me.
And like, I can see that, but at the same time, I can also see why it would bother people. Like, even my knee-jerk reaction to that is,
well, which is exactly why I am angry at the reporter, because I've been put on the spot.
Yeah.
In that way.
Here's the other thing for me is, and this is kind of calling out the other side in a way. I've been very vocal about the fact that, Star Wars nowadays makes me mad.
Right.
And I don't like the direction they've gone with it. I don't really like the stuff they've done. I keep meaning to go back to and actually watch Andor because I've heard it's good. But
I can't.
I just, I loved Star Wars so much, and I just don't feel like they respect me or the fact I was a nerd girl as a kid. And, as I've said, I feel like they took my steak dinner, gave me gruel, and said, you're supposed to like this better because it's made for you. But I mean, I'll take Mara Jade over Rey any day. Anyway.
I think that it's getting into, like, I totally see that. Like, I see where that comes from. And I do think, we were talking about how comics keeps trying to copy Watchmen and the Dark Knight, and now more and more they're pulling from the Silver Age before going back to Watchmen and the Dark Knight.
Yeah. But like the point I was trying to get to is, it's like, but I've also said that because it makes me mad, I've stopped interacting.
Yeah.
Like, I can see these clips come across, but for the most part, I'm like, I can have a knee-jerk reaction of, I think that was a terrible thing to say, or just the wrong thing to say. But I've also like just backed away. Whereas a lot of people who every time there's a promo junket, it happens again, which Star Wars isn't for us anymore. And I'm like, yeah, I acknowledge this Star Wars isn't what I want like 5 years ago. And so I stepped back.
See,
why haven't you?
See, I find this fascinating because this happened to original trilogy fans in the 90s when the prequels came out. And the fans there, the original fans, some of them acted like jackasses and gatekept too much. But there was a ton of, too bad, Grandma, this isn't for you anymore. So I'm sorry, the Anakin era, you were dicks, and there's a lot of irony now.
I mean, but even in Star Trek, you still have the Kirk versus Picard arguments.
And I like them both.
I'll take Kirk, personally. Like, I have no problem with Picard, but I'll take Kirk.
Yeah, I
He's more
mean,
fun.
yeah. They were very different things.
Yeah.
They were, and that's the thing. Next Generation, I know a lot of TOS fans hated TNG when it first came out. I liked them both. I saw them as very uh different things. It was Next Generation was Star Trek for the 90s.
Yeah. And like I watched TOS. I really enjoyed TOS, like in the same way I enjoyed
Mhm.
60s Batman.
Yeah.
I never got into TNG. The big thing for me though was I found out that it goes on for how many seasons, and Riker and what is it, Deanna,
Yeah, Troy.
Troy, it's a will they won't they the whole time until you get to the movies. I was like, nope, I'm out. I cannot handle that kind of drama.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, it was the 90s. The
Yes.
will they or won't they
Well,
was.
I mean, plus moonlighting was in the 80s, right? And
Yeah, well, exactly.
and
Yeah.
that's when TV writers got the lesson, whether right or wrong, that people don't actually want to see couples
I was
together.
well, the moonlighting for a decade
Yeah.
after moonlighting, the rule was you get them together when you end the series. The minute you get them together, you lose all the tension. That's
Mm-hmm.
it. You're done. It's interesting because for me, the big one I'm struggling with right now of not for me anymore is Dragon Age.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not out yet. And I find it kind of funny that I'm the only person who looks at what is it, Minrathous, the Tevinter capital,
Mm-hmm.
and go, oh God, that is the Night Court from A Court of Mist and Fury.
And like
With the night sky and the mountains surrounding it and the big a ring and the big open window spaces. It
it's Valaris.
is Valaris, yeah.
Which I mean, I certainly get the appeal of Valaris, but
It also is in there's an argument for it in Dragon Age tradition because Dragon Age came when BioWare was rightly afraid they were going to lose the D&D license from Baldur's Gate. Uh
ah,
and so they did lose the D&D license. So they made Dragon Age as a spiritual sequel to Baldur's Gate, but it was a mix of Forgotten Realms and Lord of the Rings and a a, a Song of Ice and Fire long before the HBO show came on. They had to pivot away from Orlais because all of that stuff came from Game of Thrones,
mm-hmm.
and there was some Dragonlance. It was this catch-all. It was this synthesis of a bunch of fantasy properties and then some historical points as well. So bringing in this very popular fantasy franchise makes sense in that regard. It's just, it doesn't look the same. It doesn't play the same. And even Inquisition didn't have the elements I fell in love with in Origins. Every game has been copying something else, and every game has its own. It has this identity crisis where okay, they brought in the dialogue wheel for Dragon Age 2 because it was popular from Mass Effect. And
Mm-hmm.
then Skyrim was popular when Inquisition came out. So all the fucking dragons, and it took forever to get out of the fucking hinterlands. And now we've got A Court of Mist and Fury, we've got Valorant, we've got Fortnite. And then we've sort of got the companion structure from Fallout games. It just, and none of the original writers are like head writers are there.
Okay, and that's something that always frustrates me is it's like I when you get stories where the writing team changes so much that like there's no one left, from the
And
original, and it becomes something totally new, which, like, okay, it's fine, but also, we know, I would much prefer, original stories rather than franchises, even though I get why they're staying in the franchise.
yeah, and
But
I don't, sometimes it can be done well. Like sometimes
oh yeah,
people can pick up the torch and do a good job. With
yes.
um with Dragon Age though, I did start seeing the politics in Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
It became less about actual romance and more about, we're going to validate your sexuality with Fingruel um relationships. And
Mm-hmm.
that's been a trend in fantasy gaming. I mean, I felt battered by Baldur's Gate 3 in
Mm-hmm.
that regard. And I can't, this is why I brought up the thing about philosophy as opposed to politics,
Mm-hmm.
because Larian clearly has a philosophy of what makes a good story. They don't let you be the shining knight hero. You are forced to do something scummy somehow. And that's okay, but that's not the first time I played Baldur's Gate. I played as a paladin, and it was
Mm-hmm.
a great experience. And I've gone back and played that game again and again and again, because there wasn't this thing where collecting all the companions was the right way. That's how you win. It was, okay, we have these companions for you, like party members, if you're an evil character, and you'll get along with this just fine. And then we've got these other characters, if you're a good character, and you'll get along this fine because you share the same values. With
Yeah.
Larian, it's forcing you into more of a divinity paradigm, which is real goodness doesn't exist. We're all pieces of shit. We're all very, very damaged. But then it got into, I still can't figure out if Halson was, the bear guy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if they were trying to be kinky, because there's a lot of that in Baldur's Gate 3, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was off brand. There was no sex that you saw in the previous games. It was all relationship. It was all kind of theater of the mind. But I can't tell whether they thought they were being really super clever in that bears don't mate the way some other animals do,
Mm-hmm.
or whether they thought they were being cool by putting in a polyamorous character. Unfortunately, it wasn't handled well. And I do think that's something that, with these stories that become very successful, like A Court of Thorn and Roses, like Twilight. I mean, the whole vibe of the last Twilight book is very, very different from the first Twilight book.
See, I'll admit, I never actually read the last one.
It's rough. It's
I
very
believe it.
Catholic.
I've that one, like, I've still watched reviews and analyses of the last one, but the the last one came out, well, when it came out, uh my family had just gone from really religious to really religious, and so part of what had to go was the Twilight books. I wasn't allowed to finish
Oh,
those. uh
even though they were on Christian book lists.
oh, that didn't matter.
That's,
No, just
see, yeah.
no. My mom was never happy that it was a vampire romance, but things got really extreme in, like, 2008, so I was not allowed to touch the last book.
I mean, you didn't miss
No.
anything, but yeah, and I remember my Anne Rice phase when I was 15,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm glad I was able to have that. I was the poster child of sneaking media I was technically too young for. Because I was so bored by the age appropriate stuff. I just wasn't there. I mean, I read Silence of the Lambs when I was 12. I shouldn't have been allowed to read Silence of the Lambs when I was 12.
No.
I will fully admit that. Not the best parenting there. But I mean, that was right next to in the basement. I'll spare people the horrors of my upbringing, but there were some really inappropriate books that I had access to. But that book made a particular kind of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, I didn't pick up all of it at 12, but I picked up enough of the Clarice Starling character being both in way over her head, but also she eked through, right? She almost got caught up in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of um just sort of barely made it out. And then, we because the whole title is about a childhood trauma that she had.
Mm-hmm.
A reminder of the night when they slaughtered all the lambs on the farm. So, that I do think that YA, I probably would have loved those books. Not, I know I would not have liked A Court of Thorn and Roses as a kid because I always rejected the immediate, I am going to protect you. I am going to be kind to you. I am going to be nice to you. I immediately rejected it because that didn't feel real to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole Feyre thing where she was accepted despite her mistakes, it wouldn't have worked for me. And I think it's interesting because I'm more understanding of it now, in that I understand why it's so important for a particular book to validate a very specific experience for very specific kids. And my concern about YA, and this is somewhat political, but I would argue it's more philosophical.
Mm-hmm.
Young adult is not for young adults anymore. There's
No.
too many people in their 20s through 30s, like mid to late 20s through 30s and 40s, opining very strongly on these books, and those are people that it's not for you.
Yeah.
The teen years are problematic. Talk to your girls or boys if they decide to read them. Good for them. Or non-binary kids. Talk to them. Don't ban things.
And that's one of the things. Like here, when couple years ago there was I don't know, was it no, like the state of Virginia or something was trying to sue Barnes and Noble for having a Court of Mist and Fury in
Yes.
the young adult section.
Yeah.
Which, you know what, I'm like, suing Barnes and Noble is dumb. The person you need to sue is, if you're going to sue anyone, you sue the publisher because they're the ones who categorized it as young adult.
Right.
And then that comes back to apparently the story that, Sarah J. Maas wanted to write a book with sex. Her publisher wanted to market it as young adult because her Throne of Glass series had already been so popular. And she said, you can publish it as young adult as long as you don't censor any of the sex or violence, which, you know what? That's a problem, in my opinion. So if you got people saying, we don't want this book in schools where kids can read it, you know what? I'm going to side with that. Because there's some things that I don't think should be in a school.
I am torn on this. In my gut, I agree with you.
And that's the thing it comes back to, is because when I step back, it's like, okay, if that's the only library kids are going to, and that's the only place they have access to pleasure reading, essentially, like, yeah, they should have access to it, especially in high school. but it's still going to come back to some of the content.
But the problem is that young adult is basically written for, I believe, 16 and up. Right?
Yes, but technically young adult is 12 to 18.
Right.
Which
right.
is a terrible
it's
category.
A terrible split. A 12-year-old has nothing in common with a 16-year-old. 12 is still middle grade. Fight me. It should be, these books are aimed just like we knew 12-year-olds were watching much music back in the day, but we didn't program for them. We were TV 14. We were, our goal was right for 16-year-olds.
Yeah.
Because it was what is it? What 12-year-olds think 16-year-olds think 18-year-olds are interested in. And so it's like, I was like, fuck that. I'm just aiming at 16-year-olds. So people who are starting to figure out who they are. And let's face it, a 16-year-old is already having sex. So I don't like that. It's just so, especially now where everything's about hookup and just the raw sexual experience. And you do see some of that in Feyre and Tamlin almost never talk, but they click sexually in a way that just doesn't happen in the real world. You have to talk. But at least, like, I sit to myself. It's like, would I prefer, it's a trolley problem, right?
Oh boy.
Here we go. I only have two choices. A 16-year-old I care about gets their curiosity sated from A Court of Mist and Fury or A Court of Thorn and Roses. I mean, A Court of Thorn and Roses has violent sex already, but would I rather they get it from there where at least there's the pretense of these two loving each other? Or do they get their curiosity sated from Pornhub on a friend's phone?
Oh God, I would take Akatar any day.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying. Like, we don't have to like the realities of teens now. We do have to do harm reduction based on that. And Pornhub is so easy to access that you've got a counter program for that. Because I do think a lot of the reason that, under 25s, whatever generation you want to call that, are so looks obsessed or so terrified of getting old is because they've seen too much of a certain type of porn too young. And they can't contextualize it. They don't have it's scaring them. It's scaring them away from relationships.